When you sent over all this stuff on metadata, I gotta admit my first thought was, oh boy, this is gonna be a tough one.
Metadata. Yeah,
Yeah, it seems pretty dense, but I mean, that's why we do these deep dives, right? To figure out what's really important.
absolutely.
And actually getting into this, it's way more fascinating than I expected.
Oh, for sure. It's one of those things, right? You encounter it all the time, but you don't even realize it. But when you stop and think about it, metadata is like, well, it's the backbone of how we find and use, all this information in the digital age.
It's true. I mean, without metadata, the internet would just be this like giant unnavigable mess.
Totally.
Like how else would we ever find, I don't know, that perfect cat video or like the research paper that's going to change the world?
Exactly, exactly. And the thing is, creating good metadata, it's not as simple as just slapping on some tags. There's a lot more to it than you might think.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Our sources keep mentioning this conceptual entanglement problem. Can you break that down for us? What does that even mean?
Okay, imagine you're trying to organize a library.
Okay.
But everyone who walks in has a completely different way of categorizing books.
Okay.
Some people might focus on genre, others on the author's nationality, still others on, I don't know, the historical period the book is set in.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah,
So even if everyone's describing the same book, they could end up putting it in totally different places based on their own, perspective.
exactly, yeah. And that's essentially what happens with metadata. We have
Yeah.
these different communities of practice, like researchers, policymakers, students even, and they all approach the same information with different goals and perspectives.
Which makes sense, right? Like if I'm a cancer researcher, I'm going to be looking at data through a very different lens than, say, a policy analyst who's focused on healthcare costs.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's where this conceptual entanglement comes into play. Because even if everyone agrees on the basic facts, those different perspectives lead to completely different ways of describing and organizing the information.
So it's not just about the data itself, it's about how we perceive it and how those perceptions shape the metadata we create.
Exactly, yeah. And our sources break this down into what they call these levels of metadata creation. These levels represent a kind of journey from how humans perceive information to how computers need that information structure to be useful.
Okay, so walk us through this journey. What are these levels and why are they so important?
Well, the first level is what they call perception.
Hmm.
And this is really about acknowledging that different communities of practice are going to have different ways of viewing the same basic entity.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Let's take with that cancer example, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So a medical student learning about cancer, they're going to be focused on the biological mechanisms, the different types of cells, the stages of the disease.
Hmm.
A policy analyst might be more interested in the prevalence of different types of cancer, the costs of treatment, the impact on the healthcare system as a whole. And a patient, well, their perspective is going to be shaped by their own personal experience, right?
Hmm.
And their need for information about diagnosis, treatment options, and support services.
Wow. Yeah, that really brings it home. You're talking about the same thing, cancer, but those different perspectives lead to completely different information needs, and that's going to impact the metadata they create and search for.
Exactly. And if those differences aren't accounted for, it can lead to a real disconnect between the information that's available and the information that people actually need.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's perception. What's the next level?
The next level is terminology. And this is where things can get really, really tricky. Because even when people are talking about the same thing, they might use different words to describe it.
Oh, yeah, I know this one. It's like that classic example of soda versus pop versus Coke, same drink, different names depending on where you're from.
Exactly, yeah. And in the world of metadata, this can be a huge headache. You could have two different data sets about the same topic, but if they use different terminology, it's going to be really difficult to combine them or compare the findings.
Yeah. So, how do we deal with this? Is there any way to get everyone on the same page when it comes to language?
Well, there are efforts to standardize terminology, things like controlled vocabularies and ontologies, but even those aren't perfect solutions
Why not?
because language is constantly evolving. New terms emerge, old terms take on new meanings, and it's really difficult to keep up with all the nuances.
Okay, so even at this basic level of words, we're already dealing with a lot of potential for confusion and misinterpretation.
Unfortunately, yeah. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Because as we move up to the next level, ontology, things get even more complex.
Ontology. That sounds pretty intimidating.
It can see that way,
Yeah.
but it's really about defining what type of thing each concept is.
Okay.
Are we talking about an event, a process, a relationship, a quality? It's about establishing the basic categories and relationships that make up our understanding of the world.
So it's like the underlying framework for how we organize information.
Precisely. And just like with terminology, there are different schools of thought when it comes to ontology. Different experts might have different ways of categorizing and defining concepts. And those differences can lead to, you guessed it, more entanglement.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. We start with perception, how different people view the same thing. Then we move to terminology, the words we use to describe those things. And then ontology, the underlying framework for how we categorize and relate those concepts. It's like, it's like building a house. And if the foundation isn't solid, the whole structure is going to be shaky.
That's a great analogy.
Hmm.
And speaking of structures, the next level is where we really start to see how these different perspectives can impact the way we organize information. This level is called taxonomy.
Taxonomy, like the system for classifying living organisms, kingdom, phylum, class, all that.
Exactly. And in metadata, we're doing something very similar. We're organizing concepts into hierarchies, creating these branching structures that help us navigate and understand relationships between different pieces of information.
So if we're talking about cancer, a taxonomy might group different types of cancer by their location in the body or by their genetic characteristics or by the stage of the disease.
Exactly. And just like with the previous levels, there can be multiple valid ways to create a taxonomy. One researcher might prioritize anatomical location, while another might focus on genetic markers. And guess what? That can lead to even more entanglement.
Okay, I'm starting to feel like I'm getting tangled up just thinking about all this. But we're not done yet, right? There's one more level.
You're right. The fifth and final level is called intentional. And this is where we get into the nitty-gritty details. It's about the specific properties that describe each concept. Things like author, publication date, genetic markers, and so on. Again, there are multiple valid ways to define and organize these properties, and the choices made here can have a huge impact on how the data is used and understood.
So it's not just about organizing concepts. It's about describing them in a way that captures all the relevant details. I'm starting to see how all these levels build on each other and how even small choices early on can have big consequences later.
That's a crucial insight, and it's something we're going to explore further in the next part of our deep dive. Because understanding these 5 levels of metadata creation is just the first step. The real challenge is figuring out how to deal with all this potential for entanglement and what we can do to create metadata that is truly clear, consistent, and useful.
Okay, I'm definitely starting to see why you call this a mess. It's like, I knew metadata was important, but I never realized just how complicated it all is.
Right. And it's not just theoretical,
Sure.
This entanglement, it can have real consequences for anyone who's trying to work with data.
Oh, I believe it. I mean, just thinking about my own research, I've definitely run into situations where, like, I couldn't use a data set because I couldn't figure out what the heck the metadata was trying to tell me.
Exactly, yeah. And it's not just individual researchers who struggle with this. Think about large organizations, government agencies, anyone who's trying to make sense of, massive amounts of data. If the metadata is inconsistent or poorly structured, it can really undermine the entire process.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's get down to, like, brass tacks here.
Right.
How does this entanglement actually play out in the real world? Can you give us some, like, concrete examples?
Sure. One of the terms our sources use is representational manifoldness.
Okay.
It's a mouthful, I know. But it basically means that there are many ways to map one thing to another at each of those 5 levels we discussed.
Okay, so remind me about that breast cancer example we talked about earlier.
Right, so you might search for breast cancer. A medical professional might use mammary carcinoma. And a research paper could use breast tissue malignant neoplasm, all referring to the same thing, but using different terms.
Yeah, and that's just one example. I can imagine that kind of thing happening at every level, from how different researchers define the stages of cancer to, like, how they categorize different treatment options.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of a cascade comes in, right?
Right.
A small problem at the perception level, like how different researchers define a particular concept, can snowball into a huge headache by the time you get down to the nitty-gritty details of the intentional level.
So it's like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
One small inconsistency can throw off the entire system.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest challenges this creates is when you're trying to combine data from different sources.
Right, because even if the data itself is accurate, if the metadata is using different languages, different categories, different definitions, it's going to be really difficult to integrate it all into a coherent picture.
Exactly. And this is where things like metadata crosswalks come in.
Okay.
These are basically attempts to translate between different metadata models.
So kind of like creating a dictionary between two languages.
Exactly.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
It is. It's like trying to translate between languages that have like slightly different grammars and dictionaries, and where the words themselves can have multiple meanings depending on the context.
Okay, I'm officially overwhelmed. It feels like we're stuck in this tangled web and there's no way out. Is this just like an unavoidable part of working with information?
It's definitely a challenge, yeah. But our sources do offer some hope, and this is where things get really interesting. They suggest that artificial intelligence, specifically generative AI like ChatGPT, might actually be part of the solution.
Wait, really? I thought AI was just going to make this problem worse. I mean, AI is trained on existing data, which means it's probably going to like inherit all the biases and inconsistencies we've been talking about.
That's a valid concern, and it's something we need to be very careful about.
Yeah.
But the key here is not to think of AI as a replacement for human expertise, but rather as a tool that can help us disentangle these complex conceptual knots.
Conceptual disentanglement.
Yeah.
Okay. So how does that work? I'm still a bit skeptical, but I'm willing to hear you out.
The idea is to use AI for what it's good at, analyzing vast amounts of data, identifying patterns, and generating potential solutions. But then we need to bring in human expertise to evaluate those solutions, right? To make sure they align with real-world needs and to ensure that we're not just perpetuating existing biases.
So it's like a partnership. AI does the heavy lifting, but humans are still in control, like guiding the process and making the final decisions.
Exactly. And our sources call this approach conceptual disentanglement. It's not about letting AI run wild. It's about using it strategically to help us make sense of this complex metadata landscape.
Okay, I like the sound of that. But how does this actually play out in practice? Can you give us some specific examples of how AI can help at each of those 5 levels we talked about?
Sure. So starting with perception, AI can be used to analyze large data sets from different communities of practice, right?
Okay.
It can look for patterns in the language people use, the categories they create, the relationships they identify.
So AI can kind of give us a bird's eye view of how different groups are perceiving the same information.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly valuable for identifying potential areas of conflict or miscommunication. It can also help us to develop more inclusive metadata models that take into account a wider range of perspectives.
Okay, that makes sense. What about terminology? Can AI help us with all the linguistic challenges we talked about?
Definitely, yeah. AI can be used to identify synonyms and variations in spelling. It can help us map different terms to standardized vocabularies. And it can even suggest new terms that might be more inclusive or representative of a particular community's language.
So it's like having an AI-powered thesaurus on steroids.
Exactly. And then we have ontology. This is where things get really interesting because AI can actually be used to help us build and refine ontologies.
Really? I thought ontologies were all about, like, philosophy and human reasoning. Can AI really handle something that abstract?
Well, it's not about replacing human philosophers. But AI can be a powerful tool for exploring different ways of structuring knowledge, for identifying potential inconsistencies or gaps in existing ontologies, and even for suggesting new relationships between concepts.
So it's like AI can help us see the ontology from different angles, like to test out different possibilities and to make sure it's as robust and comprehensive as possible.
Exactly. And that brings us to taxonomy. Remember how we talked about how different taxonomies can be created depending on the goals and perspectives of the people creating them?
Yeah, that was the one with all the branching structures, right?
Right. And this is where AI can be really helpful because it can explore a vast number of potential taxonomies, testing out different ways of grouping and organizing concepts.
So instead of having to like manually create and compare different taxonomies, we can let AI do the heavy lifting.
Exactly. AI can quickly generate and evaluate different taxonomic structures, helping us to identify the ones that are most logical, consistent, and useful for our particular needs.
Okay, that sounds incredibly efficient. What about the final level, intentional? Can AI help us with all those nitty-gritty details?
Absolutely. AI can be used to analyze existing data and metadata to identify the most relevant properties for describing each concept. It can also help us to ensure that those properties are defined consistently across different data sets and that they align with the overall goals of our metadata model.
So it's like having an AI assistant who can help us make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. I'm starting to see how AI can really be a game changer in this space. But before we get too carried away, I do have one big question.
Okay, shoot.
We've talked a lot about how AI can help us create better metadata. But what about all the existing metadata that's already out there? All the data sets that are poorly structured, inconsistent, or just plain confusing. Can AI help us fix that mess too?
That's a fantastic question. And it's one that leads us to a really important concept our sources keep emphasizing. They call it data sheets.
Data sheets, like those instruction manuals that come with new gadgets.
Kind of. But in this case, data sheets are for metadata itself. They're a way of documenting all the choices that were made during the metadata creation process, from the initial perception of the data to the final selection of properties.
So it's like a behind-the-scenes look at how the metadata sausage was made.
Exactly. And the idea is that if we can make these data sheets a standard practice, if everyone who creates metadata starts documenting their choices and making that documentation publicly available, it would create a much more transparent and accountable system.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. If we have these data sheets, it would be much easier to understand how different data sets were created, what assumptions were made, and how the metadata might be, biased or limited.
Precisely. It would be like having a window into the thought process of the people who created the data, which would make it much easier to interpret and use that data effectively.
Wow, that would be a game changer. I'm starting to feel a lot more optimistic about this whole metadata situation, but let's be realistic. We're talking about changing long-established practices, about getting people to think about metadata in a whole new way, and about integrating AI into workflows that are often very human-centric. This is not going to be easy.
You're absolutely right. There are definitely challenges ahead.
Hmm.
But I think the potential benefits are so significant that it's worth the effort.
Okay, you've convinced me. This is a vision worth striving for. But where do we even begin? What are the first steps we can take to move towards this more disentangled human AI-powered metadata future? So we've gone from feeling totally tangled up in this metadata mess to, seeing a glimmer of hope with these AI-powered solutions and these data sheets.
It is a journey, isn't it? And like any good journey, it's not just about the destination, right? It's about the steps we take along the way.
Right, because even with the most advanced AI, we still need humans to be involved to guide the process and make sure we're not just automating our existing biases.
For sure. For sure. And that's where I think this whole idea of conceptual disentanglement is so important. It's not just about using AI to clean up our metadata. It's about changing how we think about metadata in the first place.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we shift our mindset from thinking of metadata as just this technical afterthought to seeing it as this crucial element of how we create and share knowledge?
Well, I think it starts with education. We need to help people understand the different levels of metadata creation, the potential for entanglement, and the importance of making, conscious choices at every step of the process.
Right, because if people don't even realize there's a problem, they're not going to be motivated to change their practices, right?
Exactly, yeah. And it's not just about teaching people the technical aspects of metadata.
Yeah.
It's about fostering a deeper understanding of how metadata shapes the way we perceive and use information.
So it's like a literacy issue, almost. We need to become more metadata literate, just like we need to be information literate in general.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this literacy needs to extend beyond just the people who are actively creating metadata.
Right.
It needs to include everyone who's using data, from researchers and analysts to policymakers and even the general public.
Because at the end of the day, metadata is about making information accessible and understandable to everyone, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I think this idea of data sheets has so much potential. If we can get people to embrace this practice of documenting their metadata choices, making that documentation transparent and accessible, it would go a long way towards building trust and understanding.
Right. Because then you wouldn't just be getting the data, you'd be getting the context, the rationale, the thought process behind how that data was structured and categorized.
Exactly. It'd be like having a conversation with the people who created the data, which would make it so much easier to interpret and use that data effectively.
Okay, so let's say we've got everyone on board with this new metadata mindset. We're all using AI to help us disentangle our concepts, and we're all diligently creating data sheets. What does that future look like? How does this actually change the way we work with information?
Well, For one thing, it would make it much easier to combine data from different sources. Remember how we talked about those metadata crosswalks and how difficult they are to create?
Yeah, it sounded like a total nightmare trying to translate between all those different metadata languages.
Right. But if we have data sheets that clearly explain the choices that were made for each data set, it would be much easier to identify potential conflicts or inconsistencies and to develop more robust crosswalks.
So it's like we'd be building bridges between different data sets, making it much easier for information to flow freely.
Exactly. And that will have huge implications for research, policy, education, really any field that relies on data to make decisions.
I can imagine. I mean, just thinking about my own work, it would be amazing to be able to easily combine data sets from different labs, different countries, different time periods. It would open up so many new possibilities for analysis and discovery.
Absolutely. And it's not just about combining data sets. It's also about making information more findable and accessible in general.
Right, because if the metadata is clear and consistent, it means search engines can do a much better job of indexing and retrieving relevant information.
Exactly. And that means people will be able to find the information they need more quickly and easily, which will save time, reduce frustration, and ultimately lead to better decision making.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty rosy picture here, but let's be real. There are going to be some challenges along the way. What are some of the biggest hurdles we need to overcome to make this vision a reality?
Well, one challenge is simply getting people to buy into this new way of thinking about metadata, right?
Yeah.
Old habits die hard. It can be tough to convince people to change their practices, especially if they don't see the immediate benefit.
Right, because creating good metadata takes time and effort, and it can be tempting to just skip over it or do it hastily.
And that's why I think it's so important to emphasize the long-term benefits of good metadata. We need to help people understand that investing in metadata up front can actually save time and money in the long run.
Yeah.
And it can lead to much more reliable and impactful results.
So it's like that saying, measure twice, cut once. If you take the time to get the metadata right from the start, it'll make everything else much easier and more efficient down the line.
Exactly. And there's another challenge we need to be aware of, which is the potential for AI to exacerbate existing biases.
Right, because AI is only as good as the data it's trained on.
Yeah.
If we're not careful, we could end up with AI systems that perpetuate the same biases and inconsistencies that we're trying to eliminate.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so crucial to have humans involved in the process, at every step. We need to be constantly evaluating the outputs of AI systems, making sure they align with our values and goals, and ensuring that they're not just amplifying existing prejudices.
So it's not about letting AI run wild. It's about using it as a tool, as a partner, and always keeping, human judgment and oversight in the loop.
Exactly. And I think that's a good takeaway for this entire conversation. Metadata is a powerful tool, but it's a tool that needs to be used responsibly and thoughtfully. By embracing this idea of conceptual disentanglement, by collaborating with AI, and by always keeping the human element in mind, we can create a future where information is truly accessible, understandable, and empowering for everyone.
That's a future I can definitely get behind. So to all you listeners out there, next time you encounter a data set, just, take a moment to think about the metadata. Ask yourself, who created this data? What choices did they make? And how might those choices be shaping the way I'm understanding this information? Because the more we understand about metadata, the better equipped we'll be to navigate this, ever-expanding universe of information and to make sense of the world around us.
And that's a journey worth taking.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep
Into the fascinating world of metadata.
You got it.